Abducted by the Indigenous tribe that killed her family, Olive Oatman's life was never the same again. She became a slave, was traded, and eventually assimilated. But when she was finally found and returned to Western society, another nightmare awaited her. Olive Oatman's beginnings were like any other 19th century Mormon girl in Illinois, but little did she know fate had a nightmare in store for her. Born in 1837 to Mary Ann and Royce Oatman, Olive grew up in a large family of 7 children. But when she was 14 years old, her family broke away from their original Mormon group, and that's when everything changed. Olive and her family began following a new leader, James C. Brewster, but there was trouble afoot. While undertaking a pilgrimage to the border of Arizona and California, conflict and tension began to tear the group apart. Olive watched as her parents led the rebellion. The group split in two, with Brewster choosing the northern route and the Oatmans choosing the southern route. This was a tragic mistake. As the Oatman family and its following party trudged onward, Olive's father Royce became their brave leader. Unfortunately, the road to their new Holy Land was terribly bleak. The land was desolate and barren, effectively drying up everyone's hope. Many wagons began abandoning the troop as the climate and country turned against them. Hoping to reach the Colorado River, Olive and her family finally reached Maricopa Wells, but this was only the calm before the storm. Here, Olive's father received a warning from the locals that Indigenous tribes ahead were highly protective of their land. They urged him to stop venturing forward as a hostile run-in with the Indigenous citizens could prove fatal. His response, however, sealed his family's fate. Olive's father decided not to heed the chilling warning and ignored the advice to stay back. Foolishly, he decided to step into dangerous territory. The other families in the group chose to play it safe and hang back, so it was just Olive and her family, alone and vulnerable. Just 4 days after leaving the rest of the group, the Oatman clan had their first encounter with the Yavapai tribe. The Indigenous strangers wanted tobacco and food. However, the Oatman family was short on supplies and unprepared to part with anything. When they denied the request, chaos ensued. When you couple an unwillingness to share with an intrusion into occupied land, you can probably imagine that things would get nasty, and that's exactly what happened. The Oatman's stinginess enraged the Yavapai tribe, and they lunged right for Olive's father and ruthlessly clubbed him. Olive watched in horror as the Yavapais took down her father, but they weren't done yet. A bloodbath ensued, and her pregnant mother and 4 of her siblings met brutal ends as well, all clubbed until their last breaths. Only 3 of the Oatman clan managed to survive: 14-year-old Olive, 15-year-old Lorenzo, and 7-year-old Mary Ann. The Yavapais captured Olive and Mary Ann but left Lorenzo behind. They expected him to perish from his wounds, but they were wrong. Lorenzo awoke to find his entire family killed and 2 of his sisters missing. Completely alone and heartbroken, he trekked to safety, but as he pushed through the pain, a burning mission began forming in the back of his mind. While Olive and Mary Ann were at the mercy of their captors, Lorenzo made it to safety and had his injuries tended to. Eventually, he returned to the horrific scene of the slaughter and buried the bodies of his family. But the whereabouts of his 2 surviving sisters still haunted him. He became determined to find them, no matter what. While her brother managed to escape, Olive and her sister weren't so lucky. After being taken by the Yavapais, Olive had no hope for survival, expecting to perish just like the rest of her family. The tribe took the girls to the Harquahala Mountains and treated them in an aggressive and threatening way. And that's when they discovered their true purpose. The tribe used Olive and Marianne as slaves. They began carrying water and firewood, looking for food, and carrying out other menial tasks. However, the terrible treatment they endured made these chores all the more grueling. Burdened by grief, loss, and the terror of the unknown, Olive had no idea that her awful luck was about to change. Another indigenous group came to trade with the Yavapais, the Mojave people. When the chief's daughter, Topeka, witnessed the chilling treatment of Olive and Marianne, she couldn't believe her eyes. She wanted to save them. Topeka, hoping to rescue the girls, tried to offer a trade for them. At first, the Yavapais seemed unwilling to part with their new slaves. However, Topeka refused to give up, and eventually, her stubbornness paid off. In exchange for Olive and Marianne, the Yavapais received 2 horses, vegetables, beads, and blankets. It was a trade that swung Olive's destiny in a completely new direction. After finding salvation with the Mojave tribe, Olive and her sister trekked for days towards its village. Unlike the Yavapais, the Mojave tribe greeted them with openness. The chief and his family ushered the girls under their wings, taking a singular interest in their well-being. In fact, with the seeds of gratitude already planted, Olive turned a new page and made this tribe her new home. Compared with her initial captors, Olive found the Mojaves to be far kinder, and as time passed, she became assimilated into their way of life. The Mojave people gave the sisters their very own plots of land and expected them to contribute to the community just like everyone else. Olive's life turned topsy-turvy as she adopted new routines and had important duties thrust upon her. Beyond her wild survival story, Olive Oatman is best remembered for her striking facial tattoos. The permanent marks on her chin and arms were a tribal custom. Both she and Marianne bore these marks, and they held immense meaning. The tattoos proved that the Mojave people did not force the girls into captivity, but instead considered them one of their own. According to Mojave tradition, their tattoos would become a powerful tool in the afterlife. When entering the land of the dead, the deceased would be recognizable to other Mojave ancestors. Slaves, on the other hand, did not bear the same tattoos. According to anthropologist Alfred L. Kroeber, the Mojaves gave Olive Oatman the freedom to leave whenever she pleased. However, they refused to accompany her to any white settlement out of fear for their own lives. After all, being found guilty of keeping white women captive had its own dangers. Olive blamed her hesitancy to leave on her poor directional skills, but like most of her story, there may have been a lot more than met the eye. Olive must have felt very comfortable in her new life because when a group of white railroad surveyors arrived in the Mojave Valley, her reaction was stunning. Instead of rushing to them for help and revealing herself, she remained with her new family. The white surveyors stayed for an entire week trading and socializing, and Olive didn't say a word. In the mid-1850s, a devastating drought ripped through the region and wreaked havoc, leaving everyone scrabbling for sustenance. The Mojave tribe struggled with food shortages, and the consequences were heartbreaking. Olive's little sister was around 10 years old when she became startlingly ill. Olive, having lost almost everything already, worked as hard as she could to keep her sister alive. She looked for berries, roots, and birds' eggs in the hopes of finding anything to save Marianne's life. Sadly, Marianne's lack of nutrition ate away at her tiny body, and Olive began to lose all hope. To her horror, Olive watched her sister Marianne starve and perish. Traditionally, the Mojave people cremated their deceased loved ones, but they made a special exception for Marianne. The chief's wife appealed to her husband on Olive's behalf, allowing her the freedom to do whatever she wanted with her sister's remains. Olive might have met the same early demise if not for the chief's wife, who tended to her in her time of need, feeding her gruel to keep her alive. By the time she was 19, Olive had fully surrendered to her new reality. She had new friends and connections and considered herself a part of the Mojave tribe. But Olive's whiteness and true identity would always be a threat to her community. She just couldn't outrun her past, and eventually it came knocking. One day, a messenger named Francisco arrived with an unsettling message from Fort Yuma. Authorities there had caught wind of the disturbing rumour of a white girl living amongst the Mojave people. The post commander wanted the girl returned, or at least to know why she hadn't come of her own free will. Contact from the outsiders made the Mojaves more protective of Olive than ever before. They hid her away and tried to deny that she was the white girl in question. In fact, they argued that Olive wasn't white at all. Their affection for Olive fueled their resistance. They didn't want to return her. But the messenger, Francisco, wasn't about to give up. Determined to get Olive back, he made another bargaining attempt. This time, there was a trade involved. Although the Mojave accepted a white horse and blankets in exchange for Olive, fear guided their decision. Francisco passed on a pointed threat. He told the Mojaves that the whites would destroy them if they didn't free Olive. It was finally time for Olive to return to her people, but this was a hard goodbye. It was a 20-day journey back to Fort Yuma, and Topeka, Olive's original saviour, accompanied her. When she entered the fort, screams of joy and celebration surrounded her, but this was a bittersweet moment. In fact, there's reason to believe that Olive had left far more behind than she let on. When Olive returned to the Western way of life, she reunited with one of her long-lost friends, Susan Thompson. Years down the road, Susan made a shocking confession about Olive. She reported that Olive grieved her forced return. Even worse, Susan claimed that Olive had left an entire family behind. The stories surrounding Olive's life with the Mojave people are often hazy, but her close friend Susan claimed that Olive had been married and even had 2 sons. However, Olive publicly denied every rumour about a possible romance with a Mojave man. Integrating with the white folks at Fort Yuma was already a culture shock for Olive, but the biggest surprise was yet to come. Only a few days after arriving, she discovered that her dear brother Lorenzo had miraculously survived and had been looking for her this entire time. When they finally reunited, their heartfelt meeting made headlines everywhere throughout the West. But this certainly wasn't the end of Olive's story. In 1857, a new character entered Olive's life, a pastor named Royal Byron Stratton. He'd heard about the Oatman Massacre and believed that this horrifying story was tailor-made for great literature. Stratton wrote Life Among the Indian, or The Captivity of the Oatman Girls Among the Apache and Mojave Indians. It was an instant hit and became a bestseller. But there was a dark side to the book. Although Olive had lived amongst the Mojave and chose to stay with them, Stratton's novel told a different story. In it, Olive claimed that she and her sister were held by the Mojave against her will, and that she felt terrified to leave. There's a good chance that Stratton influenced this particular account, colouring the truth for the sake of sensationalism. Of course, Olive played along with any falsehoods the novel spouted. Her exaggerated claims and blatant lies helped her sell tickets, but did a disservice to the Mojave people. She told everyone that her tattoos signified her enslavement and called the Mojaves savage masters who disfigured her against her will. Stratton no doubt supported the embellished retelling and offered Olive an incentive in return. Stratton's book sold 30,000 copies, and the royalties helped turn the surviving Oatman siblings' lives around. As a result, Olive and Lorenzo had the opportunity to attend the University of the Pacific. Of course, she had to do far more than just share her story. She also had to hit the road and promote the book on a tour, and it was incredibly eye-opening. To the rest of the world, Olive Oatman's story was so horrifying it sounded surreal. This transformed her into the perfect moneymaker, a curiosity worth every penny. Most astonishing of all was the blue tattoo on her chin. On the book tour, curious audiences could come to see Olive in the flesh. In fact, Olive had a lot of firsts to her name, which made her all the more intriguing. She was the first white American woman to be tattooed, but that wasn't all. By promoting Stratton's book and telling her story to audiences, she also became one of the first female public speakers. At this time, feminism was still in its infancy. As a woman speaking out, Olive's name became wrapped up in the movement, whether she wanted it to or not. But in the end, it couldn't be denied that Stratton's book blurred truth and fiction, sensationalizing Olive's experience. She relived it time and time again, but eventually it began to take its toll. Although Lorenzo got fed up with hawking his sad story, Olive continued for about 6 years. Finally, about 10 years after returning to Western society, she decided to settle down. She married a rancher named John Fairchild, settling in Texas. But before she could embark on this new chapter, she and her new husband severed the past in the most dramatic way. Reportedly, Olive's husband John was not a fan of her collaborator Stratton. He burned as many copies of his book as he could. John likely influenced Olive's complete break with the author as well. Stratton was not welcome at the couple's wedding. He'd proven himself to be opportunistic, preying on Olive's need for financial support. Now happily married, Olive had no need for Stratton, but her awful history continued to haunt her. After breaking ties with Stratton, she became incredibly tight-lipped about her time with the Mojave people. Often seen wearing a veil to cover her face, she retreated into the shadows, shy and reserved. The loss Olive endured at such a young age caused her to carry some serious mental distress. In her later life, she struggled with depressive episodes and was emotionally disturbed. In fact, the ghosts from her past became so overwhelming, they drove her right to the edge, and her struggles caused her to have a nervous breakdown. For treatment, she tried everything, even travelling all the way to a Canadian medical spa in hopes of respite. But no amount of medicine or therapy could ever heal her. Her parentless status affected her deeply, so much so that she busied herself with charity work that reflected her own life, working with orphans. Olive Oatman's prosperous life was in stark contrast to her life with the Mojave people. After marrying John, she never had to work again. They lived in a large Victorian mansion and wanted for nothing, except maybe a child. Olive and John never had any biological children, but they did adopt a little girl who they named Mary Elizabeth. Olive gave her the childhood she never had herself. For the rest of her life and beyond, speculation about her past continued to swirl, and there was one rumour in particular that had an unexpected twist. Many believed that Olive Oatman ended her days locked up in a mental asylum, but that was horribly untrue. Instead, it was Stratton, the man she'd exiled from her life, who developed hereditary insanity. Even so, Olive's mental health struggles dogged her until the bitter end. In 1901, Olive Oatman lost her last surviving family member, her brother, Lorenzo, and she quickly followed, succumbing to a heart attack less than 2 years later. On March 20th, 1903, at the age of 65, she closed her eyes forever. Still, she'd never be forgotten. Today, her legacy and real-life horror story continue to shock and move audiences. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more videos.